So, what we're talking about today is how Western democracy got into a lot of trouble in the post World War I years, and how that's really going to basically lead into World War II, or as I sometimes call it, World War I Part 2. After World War I, Europe faced a lot of problems, most of them economic in nature. Uh, Returning soldiers needed jobs. The places that had been destroyed by the fighting needed to be rebuilt. There were factories, farms, houses, all of that sort of thing that had been just wrecked during the war. Uh, the countries that had fought in the war owed huge amounts of money. I mean, absolutely immense sums of money that they had to find ways to repay, particularly Germany, because not only did they have to pay off their debts, but they had to pay all of these reparations as well. And all of these economic problems are going to feed into a lot of social unrest in a lot of different countries, not just Germany, but others as well. Germany, of course, being hit the hardest, is going to have the most problems. There were the peace settlements made a lot of people unhappy. Again, the losers especially, but also the victors. I mean, they didn't get everything that they wanted, and so some of them were not terribly satisfied with the peace treaty as well. And all of this happens at a time when the European countries also happen to lack really strong leadership in order to help pull through this era without collapsing. And then comes the Great Depression. The Great Depression doesn't just affect the United States. We tend to think of it as being an American phenomenon. But by this point, the U.S. Economy, U.S. industry, is so well integrated into the global economy that when our economy goes down the tubes, we drag everybody else with us. And so it's really going to be problematic. It makes things just as, for example, just as Germany was starting to claw its way out of its economic problems from World War One, the Great Depression comes along. Guess who Germany's number one trading partner was? That's right, the United States. And we stopped buying things because we're in a depression. So they turn around and follow suit as well. Okay, so just as they're starting to get better, right back down the tubes. And it was caused by a lot of things. The Great Depression was caused by a lot of things. I mentioned some of them already. Some of those post-war issues, those are partly part of the problem for the Great Depression. Another big thing was overproduction of goods. People, the companies that were building things, making stuff to sell, they just built too many. And they invested so much into these things that they then couldn't sell, that it became damaging. The immediate causes of the Great Depression uh, were the New York stock market crash on Black Thursday, Black Tuesday, sorry, and the fact that a bunch of people had borrowed too much money and then couldn't pay. A lot of bad loans were made, and so banks start demanding repayment of the loans. Uh, people can't pay that, and then the banks fail. And so people lose all their confidence in the banking system and in the economy, and businesses begin to fail left, right, and center. The immediate effect is vast unemployment in the United States and around the world. There was a loss of faith in capitalism and democracy. This system has just failed. Okay, the system just collapsed on them, and as a result of that, you're going to see authoritarian leaders emerge. They're going to start coming out of the woodwork, and that becomes part of the long-term effects. Is that you see a rise of fascism and Nazism, and other forms of totalitarian rule. But not just in the countries where they actually took over, but I mean, there was a lot of that sentiment here in the United States. There was a lot of that sentiment in the United Kingdom. There was a fellow by the name of Mosley who became a serious political issue in the United Kingdom, and he was very much like Hitler. Heck, even one of the fellows who would become king of England for a brief time was a fan of Hitler's. He became Edward VIII before he abdicated, and he was pushing for as a fascist regime basically, and it's going to help be a cause of World War II. And this chart just illustrates the how badly things went. At the worst part of the Depression, Germany had 30% unemployment. The United States peaked out a little bit later at about 25. UK wasn't hit quite as hard. But that's 1 in 4, that's anywhere from 1 in 5 to 1 in almost 3 people who wanted to work could not find any work at all, much less work that was what they wanted. And what happens is when people get unemployed and into poverty, really impoverished, they get desperate, and desperation breeds radicalization. Desperation creates radicalization. And that's a phrase you want to remember. I'll repeat it several times. But what I'm saying is that when people turn to a system that had been successful before, and all of a sudden it betrays them, the answers to their problems, the system that they've always used to resolve their issues has failed them. In this case, we're talking about democracy and capitalism. It has failed them. And we see that in Germany, we see that in all across Europe, we see that in the United States. And what happens is that they turn from their traditional solutions, which have just failed, and start looking for new solutions, different solutions. And the more desperate they get, the worse the situation gets, the more radical of a solution they're going to look for. So as conditions get worse and worse and worse, people keep looking further and further and further apart from traditional systems for a new way to do things. And that just makes sense. I mean, it's been said that one definition of insanity is to try the same thing over and over and over and expect different results. And so if they keep trying these sort of 19th century liberal ideas, which for the 19th century were very liberal, but had become sort of traditional over the century, of democracy and individuality and capitalism, free market capitalism and things like that, and that doesn't seem to be working, well, to continue to try it seems to be crazy. So they try something else. And unfortunately, that something else is Nazism in Germany, fascism in Italy. And that's why they've gone to radical solutions. It's not that the Germans were naturally wanted Nazism. It's that they tried this other system and it had failed them. And so they became more radical. So their desperation made them more radical. Desperation breeds radicalization. So let's take a look at some of the ways that individual countries were affected in the post-war era. This is called the interwar years sometimes. Britain, they already had some economic problems. Remember, they had massive debt, for example, from the war. They had lost a lot of men, a lot of their upper class men in particular, the people who had gone off and served as officers and things. There's an entire generation where the young men are dead or crippled. like a huge portion of them in Britain. And so what you see is young women marrying quite a bit older men and having kids with them rather than younger men. And the children of those unions are going to be the kids that are fighting in World War II. But you lose a lot of those young men because of the war. A lot of them were the more educated men because those guys went off to be the officers. They volunteered in droves to go be officers in World War One, and a lot of them, the junior officers, and a lot of them died. So they're missing a big chunk of their population, and so that creates other economic problems. Britain's going to set up a coalition government made up of leaders from all three major parties. Because of that, there's a lot of compromises going on, and it's a bit unstable. The government will provide some unemployment benefits for the first time, and they begin to push to relax the Versailles Treaty's harsh treatment of Germany because they see that it's causing problems in Germany, which makes it difficult to do business with Germany. But France is totally not up for that. France is still wanting to punish Germany. They go through the German. There was a stretch of Germany that, according to the Versailles Treaty, they could not put troops in, but the French could, and so they did that. The French economy actually recovered fairly quickly, oddly enough, especially considering how badly damaged their border areas have been damaged. And there's zones in France that you still can't go live in. It's unsafe, called Zones Rouge, from World War One. But one of the reasons they recovered so quickly is that they went into Germany after the war, and when Germany couldn't pay its reparations, they went into this border strip with Germany and stole everything they could get their hands on. The multiple political parties competed for power. They have a series of coalition governments. They turn over again and again and again. During this era, they begin to create the famed Maginot Line, which was a set of truly impressive fortifications that were all interlinked and had overlapping fields of fire and all this. They were just insane and very expensive. They spent a huge chunk of their defense budget building these fortifications along their border with Germany. And the original plan was to carry it all the way across to the English Channel. But eventually, after a decade or so, they got tired of spending just such massive amounts of money on these fortifications, which, had World War I been fought then, and the Germans had come across that line, that would have stopped them cold in their tracks. There would have been no invasion of France. It was just incredible. But they don't finish the line. They don't carry it all the way to the English Channel. The government begins to strengthen their military, obviously, and they start to seek alliances with other countries again, including the Soviet Union, which is unusual. Most countries in Europe are distancing themselves from the communists running the Soviet Union. But the French, they have long been pretty friendly with the Russians. You saw it in World War One. You saw it. There was a reason why the Germans were worried about being attacked from both sides, and because the French and the Russians, except for the Napoleonic era, they've actually been very friendly with one another over the years. Now, the U.S. in particular did emerge from World War I in pretty good shape, and for a decade, we had a pretty big economic boom, and that actually leads into the crash of the 30s because we overextended big time. And that's a big chunk of what causes the Great Depression and why it gets so bad, because we had created such a huge inflated bubble that when it pops, we fall a long way. The U.S. had stayed out of the League of Nations, which was our idea, but still took a leading role in international diplomacy during the 1920s, pushing for naval limitation treaties, the Washington Navy Treaty, for example, which said that each of the major naval nations in the world would be limited to how much they could build in the way of large ships. And that's a result of the idea, well, at the time, the only way of projecting power overseas was by using a navy. We had a big Red Scare in the years immediately after World War One, where the people and government of the United States got very afraid that foreign-born radicals and communists were going to try to overthrow the United States. Why? Well, because we just saw it happen over in Russia. And the Russians or the Soviets are talking about spreading that idea to other countries. And so we were very worried about that. And as a result, Congress is going to pass some immigration laws that set up very strict quotas, uh, limiting immigration from Europe and other countries, but primarily these laws apply to Europe. We already had laws applying to most other countries um, that are going to, the idea, of course, is to keep these radicals and uh, anarchists and communists out of the United States. It has a strange backfire, though. It prevents us from taking in European Jewish refugees in the 30s. Now, of course, y'all have heard about the Great Depression in the United States, and when you take History 1302, you'll get a lot about it. But the U.S. in the Depression, it starts really in 1929 when the stock market crashes, and that's usually given as the start, October of 29, of the Great Depression. And the president who was in office, who had only been in office for a few months at that time, was Herbert Hoover. He takes the blame. He's a Republican. He takes the blame for it. He takes the blame for how bad it gets because he doesn't seem to be responding quickly and strongly. And he really probably didn't respond strongly enough. But nobody really knew exactly how bad it was going to get, and he was concerned about making some steps that he thought were wrong. And so Hoover gets blamed for it. The Republican Party gets blamed for it. And as a result of that, when the new elections come up in 1932, the Republicans are all pushed out of office. And you get a new president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who promises a New Deal, which is a massive package of economic and social programs designed to fight the Great Depression. And while it does provide some relief, the New Deal does help. It puts a lot of people to work, puts millions of people to work, but it doesn't end the Depression. As we'll see in 1937, when worried about how much money he's spending and the debt that the United States government is getting into as a result of it, FDR pulls back on some of his employment programs, and immediately everything starts to go south again. So he has to turn around and reintroduce new programs to help prop up the economy. And that's going to continue. The New Deal helps, but it doesn't end the Depression. What really ends the Great Depression is World War II. And here's just a couple of images of from the United States during the Great Depression, soup lines and bread lines. You see the top, free soup, coffee, and donuts for the unemployed. A lot of religious organizations did this, and you would go in and get fed, and while they were feeding you, they would, be reading from the Bible or something, preaching sermons, stuff like that. So the idea, of course, was to get people in to listen to what they had to tell them. Political organizations did it as well, and some organizations that were just, hey, we just want to help people. Um, so there were a lot of attempts to assist people, but really it didn't. It helped. It kept people alive, but it didn't really change things too much. And then here in the lower right, we have one of the most ironic photos of all time, where you have a line of, this was taken in Harlem in New York. You have a line of black men, women, and children standing in line to get bread. This is a bread line. And they're standing in front of this sign, which was selling cars. But it says, "World's highest standard of living. There's no way like the American way." And you have this lovely white family out for a Sunday drive in their car, and that was, like I said, what they were selling. But um, it's just very ironic that you have this typical middle class, upper middle class white family and it's talking about this high standard of living, and yet standing just in front of this is a line of the people that the system had failed. Well, the system had failed a lot of people during the Depression, but um, the American way, it generally speaking, it does seem to work pretty darn well, but occasionally it's got its hiccups, and this was a big one. In the interwar years, there's a lot of other changes, not just economic ones, but societal and cultural ones that are going on. And so this is another cause of friction in the various countries. All kinds of new scientific theories and discoveries are being made. We discover a lot about radioactivity. Marie Curie, um, for example, the Polish-born, French-wed scientist who totally deserves multiple Nobel Prizes that she didn't get because she did all kinds of things. This poor woman actually ends up dying of cancer caused by these experiments she did with radioactive particles because didn't know what it did to people. Um, uh, she just discovered so many things about how radioactivity works, but unfortunately didn't discover that until it was obviously too late. And so the whole concept of radioactivity and that atoms release charged particles and that the one element can decay and become another one is created during this time. It's all discovered during this time. Einstein in the interwar years is doing his work on relativity and discovers that measurements of space and time are not absolute and that they can be affected by things like gravity, for example, and accelerations. Sigmund Freud is doing his work, starting in Austria, moving to the United States because he was Jewish, and the climate in Austria and Germany was becoming anti-Semitic, and so he left. But the same reason Einstein left. Einstein was Jewish as well, and so he came to the United States when things in Germany started to not be so wonderful for Jews. Strangely enough, before the Nazis took over, Germany was actually one of the best places in Europe to be Jewish. They had the fewest legal restrictions and things on them. But that's also partly why when the change comes, it's so easy for people to shift into, because since they had few restrictions, since they had been free to sort of live and work and do things as they liked, they had become successful. A lot of them had become wealthy, successful professionals and things. One of the things Jewish faith typically really admires is education, and so a lot of Jewish men and women too, but men were educated professionals, and they were, financially successful and stable and everything. And at a time when all of a sudden everything's going bad, you look at the rich, and not just, we're poor Germans, they're rich Jews, and they start to not see them as Germans but as Jews, and that's what really causes a lot of the problems. It's again that whole us and them thing that people do so well. Anyway, which Freud probably would have thought was very interesting. Freud starts looking into how people's minds work, and he discovers or believes that the subconscious mind is what drives human behavior. That there's a level of activity that goes on below the surface that we don't really know about. And so he creates this method of studying people called psychoanalysis, which is one of the more common forms of therapy and treatment now, is to use psychoanalysis to discover what mental health issues you have, what causes them, and how to try to work them out so that you will improve and get better. There's a lot of artistic and literary trends too. So the arts are changing a lot as well. Art, for example, develops new styles, exploring different ways of using color and line and shape rather than doing realistic or even the semi-realistic of Impressionism. They start to move more into the surreal and abstract, and things like cubism and things develop as art styles, uh, partly escapist, um, and partly just trying out new things. And so you begin to see things like Salvador Dali's surrealism, for example, or Munch, the Scream, is made during this time period. The Melting Clocks, everybody's seen that one. Dali's Melting Clocks, which I can't remember the actual name for off the top of my head. That's a surreal art. Architecture changes. They begin to reject the sort of classical traditions and developed new styles. You've got the Bauhaus school, which starts in Germany. Sounds German. Guess what? It's German. Blends science and technology with design. You get the Art Deco, which I actually kind of like. I think Art Deco looks pretty cool. Sort of architecture design. And you see that also in that those design elements carry over into a lot of like consumer goods and things. You see like Art Deco lamps and sorts of things that sort of echo the architectural styles. And you see an American architect named Frank Lloyd Wright, who begins to experiment with the concept that the function of a building should determine its form, that form should follow function. And so you should design a building based around what it's supposed to do, make it more useful for what it's to do. And so that begins to change how things are built and how things are designed. In literature, you see a lot of people who had been in the war writing, and you get a group of people known as the Lost Generation. Books that expose the grim horrors of modern warfare, like Erich Remarque, who was German, wrote a book called All Quiet on the Western Front. You see Hemingway is writing during this time, A Farewell to Arms, for example, where he writes about an ambulance driver who decides that he's not going to do this anymore. And he deserts with this woman that he loves and all of that sort of thing. And a lot of the writers were people who had fought in the war and seen its horrors up close and were disillusioned with the world that had created it. And so they write about things that like that. The Great Gatsby is going to be written during these interwar years. F. Scott Fitzgerald, where he's making comments on American society, for example. And some writers even experimented with using a method called stream of consciousness, which is kind of how I lecture, honestly, where you basically just, as you think of things, as you work your way through something, you write it down. And that's basically what I do with these lecture notes, is I use the notes as my basis, but then I just go on and carry on about them. And that's known as stream of consciousness writing. And in this case, stream of consciousness talking. And so the point is, there's a lot of things that are changing. After World War I, a lot of people wanted to go back to the way things were before 1914. They wanted to turn the clock back. But there's a ton of social changes going on as a result of the war itself. It had changed social values and had damn near killed off the old class system in Britain, because it had literally killed off many of the sons of those people, the sons of England's wealthy gentleman class, the gentry and the aristocracy. Russia's entire nobility was eliminated as a result of the Civil War. They either lost their position and quietly hid out and became just people, or they were killed, or they ran away. Germany loses its nobility. People still, had wealth and titles and things, but they lose a lot of their prerogatives because the empire is destroyed and the emperor has gone away. And so sort of the basis for all of that is gone. They became a republic. They set up the Weimar Republic, based in Weimar, which is why it's called that, and not Berlin. Working class people who had borne the brunt of the hardship in the war, of course, just like they always do, they said, we want more out of life now. We demand better. Young people rejected the values of the Victorian age. They said, these are the values that got us into this huge, terrible thing. We don't want anything to do with that. They also look at, we've had our fill of suffering for now, and we want to enjoy life, and we're going to cut loose and really get a little crazy. And so they start rejecting 100 years almost of the Victorian sort of values and chase excitement. Jazz music becomes huge. It's just a new kind of up-tempo music that it becomes emblematic of the 1920s, particularly in America, but really around the world. And heck, it's even called the Jazz Age sometimes. Because it seemed like everything was moving at higher speed and in new ways, and with sort of just like jazz music did. And so you see you basically have two kinds of spirit in the 20s. You've got people who are excited and going out and exuberant and living life because they've suffered, and now we're going to live, dadgummit. And then you have people who had been ground down by the war and everything, and who are getting radical in a different way, and they're saying, we're going to scrap that old system and rebuild. And you see that happening over this period of 10 to 20 years. Another thing that's going to help with these changes is new technologies that are going to help create a mass culture. You're going to see, for example, the lessening of things like regional dialects. The United States, you see this in old movies where you've got, like old war movies, there's always somebody called Tex, and Tex from Texas or somewhere in the South, and sometimes he's just from the South and they still call him Tex. And he talks like this, y'all, and and then you've always got the sharp New Yorker talking like this, yeah? And they can almost not even understand each other. That was actually true. You could take a Brooklyn, New Yorker and a good old boy from, say, South Alabama, and they couldn't hardly talk to each other because their dialects and their accents were so strong, and the tempo of their speech was so different that even though they're speaking essentially the same language, they were almost unintelligible to each other. Well, that starts to be reduced thanks to invention from a fellow by the name of Marconi, the radio. And radio spreads very widely, and in the 20s becomes sort of a fixture in basically every American household. And it's going to bring news and music and sports and entertainment programs from the whole world straight into people's homes, and they hear it. It's not just reading about it, it's hearing it. I don't know if you've ever learned a word by reading it, and then when you say it, you mispronounce it because you've never heard it said. You know what it means, so you're using it properly, but you're mispronouncing it. I've done that. I certainly have. But that's because you learned it by reading it, not by hearing it. Well, what happens is that as people begin to hear these programs and these songs and things, one of the things that they intentionally did was tried to make it as easily understandable by as many people as possible. And so what happens is you have to sort of an amalgamation of dialect, and people start to hear things in a new way, in a different way, and they begin to pronounce things that way. It begins to shift. And so you really do see a cultural shift in even how we speak and things. And then, of course, that modifies how we write things and our understanding of things. Cars become very affordable, and middle-class people gain great mobility. Henry Ford is in his heyday during this time period. He builds the Model T and the Model A, and his goal is to make a car that anybody with a job can afford. And a basic Ford automobile was about $400, $500. Now, that was $400, $500 in their money, but that was still very inexpensive. I mean, you're talking 8, 9,000, maybe $10,000 now. It was something pretty much anybody with a job could afford. And that was the idea. Now, that was kind of a bare bones model, but it gives people an unbelievable level of mobility that they'd never really had before. You see a lot of labor saving devices coming out. The vacuum cleaner. Vacuum cleaner is a game changer for people or for women, because it cuts down the number of hours used just to clean floors. On average, I read this once, on average, it took women about 8 hours a week just to keep the floors in the house clean. That's a full 8-hour day just to keep the floors in a single family living situation, an apartment for a family, or not just like a one-room apartment, but like, a family-size apartment, a 3-bedroom, 2-bedroom sort of thing, or a small house. It took a woman all day, one day, to just clean the floors. Now she could do it in a couple hours. It cut the time by a factor of 3 or 4. Washing machines for clothing, and rapidly it decreased the amount of time women spent doing that. What that means is they have more time. They don't spend as much time doing household chores, and so they have time to do other things. We will start with Italy, because in the West, that's where the first of the dictators takes over. The conditions in Italy did favor the rise of a dictator, in this case, a fellow by the name of Benito Mussolini. Italian nationalists had been very outraged by the perceived insult of the Paris Peace Conference and the Treaty of Versailles that came from it, because their demands were virtually ignored. What they wanted, they basically were ignored. And nobody of any sort of pride likes to feel like they're unimportant, but that's exactly how the British and the French, and to a lesser degree the U.S., made the Italians feel. They were insulted. At the same time, inspired by the revolution that was going on successfully in Russia, the Italian poor decided that they were going to start making demands, and they seize lands, go on strike, or seize factories, and make demands that there be change, that the system that had kept them as poor peasants and workers be overturned. And you've got the same economic problems of the unemployment, trade going down, taxes going up, and the government splits into all of these various feuding factions, where it becomes impossible to get anything done, and so they seem powerless to end all of these rising problems. You've got peasant revolts, essentially. You've got worker anarchy, and they call themselves anarchists, by the way, even though they weren't really anarchic. You've got mass unemployment. You've got serious economic problems. So there's all this turmoil, and it seems like the government can't do anything about it. So people begin to get desperate, and they turn to a new solution. Now, by the way, at the time, Italy was a kingdom. It was the Kingdom of Italy. They had a constitutional monarchy. And so along came a man who used to be a school teacher and had become a newspaper journalist, and he advocates a new idea called fascism. And in theory, Italy under him will remain a parliamentary monarchy, and in reality, it became a dictatorship. Mussolini and his followers, who were known as black shirts, create a model of strength and order and organization. And in all the chaos of Italy, they seem like, look, here is a rock to which we can cling. This man is going to lead us, and these problems will be solved. The iconic one, the thing that people talk about, is that the Italian train system was notoriously bad. The lines were in bad shape. The drivers were, the engineers and everything were constantly going on strike. The maintenance people were going on strike. The maintenance of the trains was not good. They were always breaking down. And so you could never depend on a train. And that's how people traveled in Italy by and large, if they wanted to get from one place to another or get their goods from one place to another. And so when Mussolini begins to take over, one of the things that happens is he takes over the economy and he makes the trains run on time. And that's a big draw, believe it or not. And even years later, people will say, well, at least Mussolini had the trains on time. As much terrible things as Mussolini does, and he does. Mussolini's not a good dude. He got the trains running on time, and people will say that for decades, because after the war, after World War II, Italy, they get a little bit crazy again. Not as bad, but still not great. So Mussolini takes power. He and his black shirts take power, partially through fear tactics, same way the Nazis will later. The other political parties become afraid of them. And as they gain power, he actually outlaws the other political parties. And so by 1925, Mussolini is the prime minister of Italy, and he's running the show. Okay, he assumes the title Il Duce, which I just like to say because it's fun, which means the leader, the duke, the leader in Italian. They rely on secret police and massive propaganda campaigns to garner public support and crush any dissent. Mussolini is going to bring the economy under state control, just like the Soviets did. But unlike socialists, he does preserve capitalism. If you remember when we talked about the new economic policy that Lenin had, that's basically what Mussolini does. The government controls all of the major industries, the means of production, the mines, the farms to a lesser degree, but the railroads, the healthcare, takes over healthcare and all of that sort of thing. But at the lower levels, there is still capitalism. So, the guy selling you your shoes is still there. The restaurants are still open. The farmers still own the land that they are working. They do break up a bunch of the big estates, but they own the land that they're working, but they can really only sell to the government, who then sets the prices and things. So there's all of that. Workers received poor wages, though. Their wages don't go up, and they lost the ability to strike. If they went on strike, they would be arrested. The thing about their social policies is that under fascism, and this is important, the individual was not important. And this is a big change from the humanism and individuality of the 19th century. Men were urged to become soldiers, ruthless warriors. Women were called on to produce children to later become these warriors that they needed. And it starts with youth groups. They toughen up the children, teach them to obey strict discipline. These are all models that later groups like the Nazis will follow. So let's define fascism real quickly, because it's a term that gets used a lot and people don't really know what it means. The term is meant nowadays usually as any kind of non-communist authoritarian system, which is, okay, that's how we use it now, but that's not what the term actually originally meant. In the 1920s and 30s, it meant slightly different things in different countries, but all of them had some same basic features. It's extremely nationalistic. It rejects the Enlightenment era of the 18th and 19th centuries, reliance on reason and individuality and concepts of equality and liberty and democracy. Fascism rejects all of that. They pursue aggressive foreign expansion, both as a means of alleviating economic problems and as a means of proving dominance of your nation, of your nationality. They all glorify war and usually portray it as a noble struggle for survival. We must fight these wars or our enemies will destroy us, even when they have to make up enemies that don't really exist. Because a lot of these rulers are either self-deluded or intentionally deluding others for political gain, for personal political gain. But the key, the absolute key, is that the people should have a blind loyalty to the state, that individuality is not important, but what you as an individual can do as part of the nation, as part of the state, that's your value, is as a cog in this giant machine. But you should be blindly loyal to the state, and the state is embodied in the power of a single autocratic leader. Louis XIV would have been so proud of these guys. L'état, c'est moi. And here we go. Photos of, or pictures, not really photos, of the major fascist leaders of Western Europe in the 20s and 30s. To the left, we have Il Duce, that's Mussolini in the gray with the big eagle-looking thing on his hat. In the center, we have Francisco Franco, Generalissimo Francisco Franco, who is the nationalist ruler of Spain, who takes over after the Spanish Civil War in the late 1930s. And of course, to the right, everybody recognizes this dude. That is the little Australian corporal who became master of Germany. That would be Adolf Hitler. You know, actually, once upon a time when I was teaching 8th grade, I may have told y'all this already, I actually had a student who claimed that Adolf Hitler was a myth, that he didn't really exist, and that all of that was just anti-Aryan propaganda. Yeah, the young lady was, she had been raised by people who were members of probably the KKK or something to that extent, something to that effect, and she simply would not believe that this guy actually existed, that he did any of the things that he did do, or as she put it, supposedly did, and believed that all of it was fake propaganda films and stuff. Just, you can't, I don't know how you argue against willful ignorance like that. So after World War I, Germany will create a new government, a democratic government, known as the Weimar Republic, starting in 1919. The old Kaiser, he had abdicated. His son is going to be out as well, and they create a republic. And it's supposed to be led by a president who would act as the head of state, and a chancellor who's going to act as prime minister in the legislature. And they faced just tons of problems from the start. The government was weak for the same reason, for example, that France had so many problems. They have lots of small parties, and so they have to form coalitions, and those coalitions aren't very stable. The government comes under constant fire from both the right and the left. The more conservative people say, you're going too far, and the people more to the left, more radical, are saying, you're not doing enough. You're too much like the old way. And so that's part of why there was so much turmoil in those political parties and their inability to create governments. Germans of all classes blamed the Weimar Republic for accepting the Treaty of Versailles. They didn't have any choice. It was an imposed treaty. They had lost the war, and it was going to be the way that the winners said it was going to be. But because Germany had never been invaded, there was this idea that they had never really lost the war. And so they say, well, the Republic gave up on it. And it's their fault we have all of these terrible things. When Germany fell behind in reparations payments, France, according to the treaty, was permitted to go into the Ruhr Valley, which is sort of the border zone on the German side of the border, and they basically looted the joint. It was a heavily industrial area, and they went through and just basically looted the place in order to make up the reparations payments. Uh, in order to help pay those reparations, the Weimar Republic printed lots of money, and that created runaway inflation, just ridiculously high rates of inflation, which ruined people. People who had had savings found in a matter of days or weeks that the money they'd saved all their life was now worthless. Banks were ruined by the inflation. It was just ridiculous. It was foolish to do it, but they did it anyway. And this is just going to cause even more misery and despair. Back during World War I, Adolf Hitler had fought in the German army, even though he was not German. He was Austrian. Ethnically, he's German, but didn't live in the German Empire. Anyway, he lived in the Austrian Empire. But he fought in the German army. And after the war, in 1919, he's going to join a small group of right-wing extremists known as the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which in German is Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterparty, or NSDAP, which is why you'll see things NSDAP. And being good Germans, they hated to say the whole great big long name of things, so they get abbreviated to Nazi. And he gets put in charge of propaganda very quickly and recruiting, because he's just an electrifying speaker. His speeches drew big crowds, bringing lots of new members, and within a year he's become the leader of the party. And one key to his success was that the message that he gave to other veterans of World War I, which is largely referred to as the Dolchstoß myth, Dolchstoß Legende, which is the Dolchstoß myth. Dolchstoß means backstab. And what this is this idea, this belief that had been bandied around a little bit, and he just latched on to, as did many others, that Germany didn't really lose the war, that the Allied powers had never invaded, and so they hadn't really lost, but that the German army and people were stabbed in the back by the Jews and communists in the government, and that everything that had gone wrong since then was their fault too. It's all the fault of the Jews and the communists who stabbed us in the back. And he says that the bad times ever since losing the war aren't our fault, are not your fault. And that's very powerful to people who felt the blame for the war. They had to accept the blame for the war. That was part of the Treaty of Versailles, for example. And they held a lot of personal guilt for all of the awful things that were going on in Germany, thinking that, man, if only I had fought harder or longer or whatever, we could have avoided this. And so that really made a lot of these desperate men feel better, and they liked that. And they said, well, if he's talking sense about this, maybe the other things he says make sense. And so they begin to follow him. He grows the organization, and by 1923, he actually makes a failed attempt to seize power in the Bavarian city of Munich. It's called the Bierhall Putsch, which Putsch means sort of the same as coup, an attempt to overthrow the government. And it started in a beer hall, which is why it's called the Bierhall Putsch. Anyway, it fails. He's tried. He's briefly imprisoned for treason. I think he spent 8 months in jail or something like that. While he's there, he writes a book called Mein Kampf, which means my struggle. And this is basically going to become later on it'll be the basic book of Nazism. It's my little Nazi book or whatever. Nazism 101, if you like. And it becomes the basic explanation of all of the goals and ideology of the Nazi Party. So, like the other places, hard times in the Great Depression made people desperate, and desperation breeds radicalization. And Hitler comes out with a plan, and he says, we are going to fix all of these problems. And Nazi membership grows rapidly as a result, because these people are desperate. And in 1933, the Nazis will win enough seats in their parliament, that's the Reichstag in Germany, that they got to elect Hitler Chancellor of Germany. And within a year, he had gotten rid of basically everybody else in positions of power, renamed himself Der Führer, which means the leader, and made Germany a one-party state. You could only be in the Nazi party. All other political parties were illegal. And finally, once he's got all the power in his hands, he then went and purged his party of any rivals in what's called the Night of Long Knives. He basically sent assassination squads around murdering other Nazis so that he would be unquestioned leader of the Nazi party. And once Hitler is in charge, he declares that he is going to create a new German empire, and this is the third one, so he calls it the Third Reich. Reich is German for empire. And the policies of the Third Reich, he says it'll last 1,000 years, and he's only off by, 987 years or so. Um, the political policies that he's going to pursue is he repudiates the Treaty of Versailles. He says, we're not listening to that anymore. He organizes within Germany a system of totalitarian rule. He's going to control every aspect of everybody's lives, and he uses methods of terror and repression to do it. His economic policies, he launches huge public works programs and begins to rearm Germany, which is a total violation of the Versailles Treaty. They begin building warplanes and tanks and artillery and heavy machine guns and U-boats and warships and all of these things that the Treaty of Versailles said you can't do. He starts doing it. He says, "What are you going to do about it?" He literally basically looks at France and Britain and says, "What are you going to do about it? You're not going to do anything. Just go away." And they didn't. They let him do it time and time again, and we'll talk more about that later. The social policies of the Third Reich is that the Nazis are going to indoctrinate people young. They teach them in the schools, and you'll see something kind of scary here in a little bit. They are brainwashing these little kids. They even go to the point where they have hotels where young women who are pregnant but not married, or who have gotten pregnant while married to someone who is maybe off fighting the war and they got pregnant somehow and don't want anyone to know, they would go stay in these hotels for a while. And when the baby was born, the government just took the child. And they voluntarily gave up the child basically to these orphanages, when they were called SS Kinder, children of the SS. Now, to do that, you had to have proof that you were Aryan and all, but it was crazy. And so they really focus on indoctrinating these young people, so that 10 years later, I mean, these kids are true believers, man. And he spreads his message of racism, anti-Semitism, nationalism, militarism, and totalitarianism, and everybody starts to buy into it. For women, they pushed that women should stick to traditional roles, Kinderküche and Kirche, children in the kitchen and church. Not that they liked churches much. They tried to do away with religion. Religion was an obstacle for the Nazis. They tried to get rid of religion and replace it with statism, with basically worship of Hitler and the Nazi rules. They sought to purge or purify. This is under cultural policies. They sought to purge or purify German culture of any non-Aryan influences. They had book-burning bonfires, things that were works that were written by Jews or the French or Russians or communists or anybody. They would destroy them. even things that were priceless, copies of books that were very rare, and works of scientific merit, things that, for example, like Einstein had written. They just destroyed them and threw them out. Said, "Nope, it's not Aryan," or they lied about who did it and rewrote it. The Nazis even went so far as to give medals to women who had many children. For having four or more children, you got the Order of German Motherhood, which was a little ribbon and medal that you could wear. They had the Hitler Youth, Hitler Jugend organization. They got rid of the Boy Scouts. They got rid of all the other youth programs and created this to brainwash kids into being Nazis. And they had a girls' version as well. I forget what they call it off the top of my head, but they had a different version for girls, and the version for girls was to teach them to be good German mothers. The Hitler Youth version was to train them to become soldiers and be ready to fight for Germany. This poster here says "Ach du," it means one day, and this Hitler Youth is looking forward to being an SS soldier. The other magazine is the official women's magazine of the National Socialist Party, and this is for Muttertag, Mother's Day, 1939. They're celebrating mothers and their contribution to the war effort. Now, pretty much everybody knows that Hitler and the Nazis really had it out for the Jews, and there's reasons for that we'll discuss later on. But basically, he and his followers set to drive out all the Jews from Germany. And there were a lot of reasons for that. One reason was they wanted to steal all their stuff and use it to help pay for everything that they were doing. So in 1935, they passed a series of laws called the Nuremberg Laws, which place a lot of restrictions on Jews. It revokes their German citizenship. They became no longer citizens and therefore had none of the protections of citizens. They outlawed intermarriage and actually retroactively annulled any marriage between someone who was Jewish and someone who was not. They began to restrict what kind of jobs they could have. If you were a Jewish physician, it became illegal for you to have any patients who were not Jewish, and so on and so on and so on. So they made it very difficult for Jews. And so a lot of the Jews, they sold off what they had and got the heck out of Germany, went to other countries as quick as they could. Some of them tried to last it out. One of the few groups he didn't go after was anybody who had fought in World War I who had earned an Iron Cross. Jewish men who had earned an Iron Cross, which is a medal for valor in battle, were exempt from a lot of the Nuremberg laws. Not that they didn't get mistreated, because they certainly did, but a lot of their laws, the Nuremberg laws, didn't apply to them. But it wasn't that many as far as the total population, of course. So many of these Jews will flee Germany. Very few managed to get to the U.S. because of our strict immigration laws. In November of 1938, in response to a young Jewish man in Paris shooting a Nazi diplomat there, the Nazis led mobs through Jewish communities all over Germany. And they smashed windows and beat people and burned some places and murdered a few people and raped a few women and looted some stores and just had a grand old time on what's known as Kristallnacht. It means the night of broken glass, because all of the broken glass in the streets made them look like they were shining like crystal in the street lights. Hitler, of course, would send tens of thousands of Jews to concentration camps. And then he and his followers planned what was known as the final solution to the Jewish question. And this is to make Europe, as they would have said, Judenfrei, free of Jews. They wanted to get rid of all the Jews from Europe, and mostly they would carry that out through extermination, through genocide. And that's revealed. Their plan for how to do that is going to be revealed at a conference in a suburb of Berlin called Wannsee, and so it's called the Wannsee Conference in 1942, where many high-level Nazis were in attendance to that. Hitler himself was not, but there were plenty of others.
Here, the march of history was reversing itself. In Italy, it began when an ambitious rabble-rouser set his followers marching on Rome. The country, like every other country after the last war, was torn by political unrest, hard times, unemployment. Two courses were available to the Italian people. They could solve their problems in a free, democratic way, or they could let someone else do the solving for them. They made the tragic mistake of choosing the second course. They put their trust and faith in this one man. They believed he represented them. Actually, he planned to betray them for the selfish interests of himself and the group back of him, just as he had earlier betrayed those who first supported him. In Germany, another and even more forceful demagogue set his followers marching from the Munich beer hall. He too had the sinister opportunity to take advantage of post-war chaos. But he also had certain distinctive German characteristics to play on. To start with, the Germans have an inborn national love of regimentation and harsh discipline. He could give them that. The German army, and through them the people, had never acknowledged German defeat in the last war and were anxious for revenge. That too he promised them. The wealthy and powerful industrialists were fearful of losing any of their wealth and power and were ready to back anyone who would retain it for them. He promised to take care of them, too. This man cunningly played all these ends against the middle and ruthlessly set out to murder the newborn German Republic. As the will of the Emperor. Finally, there is only one obstacle left. The word of God and the word of Führers cannot be reconciled. Then God must go. I am absolutely clear in my own mind, and I think I can speak for the Führer as well, that both the Catholic and Protestant churches must vanish from the life of our people. Thus spoke Dr. Alfred Rosenberg. And if you have any doubt that he spoke for his Führer, here's what happened. thousands of other men of God, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, were persecuted, arrested, confined in concentration camps.
Our Führer is the intermediary between his people and the throne of God. Everything the Führer utters is religion in the highest sense. It is only on one or two exceptional points that Christ and Hitler stand comparison. For Hitler is far too big a man to be compared with one so petty.
German classrooms.
Adolf Hitler ist unser Retter, unser Held, der edelste Führer auf der ganzen Welt. Für Hitler leben wir und wir sterben gerne wir. Für den Führer bis zum Tod, denn er ist unser Gott.
Yes, take children from the faith of their fathers and teach them the state is the only church, and the head of the state is the voice of God.
All right, so that's going to do it for this chapter. We're going to move on. The last chapter we're going to cover is over World War II. The videos will be broken up into multiple parts. They don't really necessarily tie along with like sections of the chapter or anything. It's just information I definitely want you to know about World War II. So that's what you've got to look forward to. The first one is called Goose Steps Towards War, and it's how this is sort of the things that directly lead into World War II. So until then, we'll talk to you soon.